portrayed as the bride elect of God, chosen and precious to God. Israel is that one for whom God has paid a dowry, a bride price, if you will. She's betrothed to God as her husband. God has made vows to her and entered into a covenant marriage relationship with her. All of this is the language. All of this is the language of this marriage that we see in these early chapters, early verses of the book of Genesis. But then, as you well know, as we proceed to the New Testament, Christ's love for His church is stated in terms of a husband's love for his bride. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 25, as the Apostle Paul begins to put forth an example of how wives are to relate to their husbands and how husbands are to relate to their wives, what example does he hold before them but the relationship, the deeply intimate and personal union that exists between Jesus Christ and His church? For he says, beginning in verse 25, husbands, love your wives. How are you to love your wives? You love your wives as Christ loved the church, self-sacrificially. He gave His life and gave Himself up for her. You see this wedded language. You see this marriage language. You see this language of matrimony here. And why did He do this? That He might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the Word. Now you go back to your Ezekiel 16 passage, and what did God do to Israel as a nation typified by an off-cast child still saturated with the blood of birth and the umbilical cord uncut? What does God do with Israel? He washes and cleanses her, wraps her in swaddling clothes. In the same way, Christ here is washing and cleansing and sanctifying the church. He's cleansing and making pure and holy and beautiful His bride, so that He might present the church to Himself in splendor. A beautiful bride, cleansed and pure and holy and clothed with the very robe and cloak of His own righteousness. You see the pictures through the Old Testament into the New here, do you not? Without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Now, where does that concept come from? Rewind to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 23. What was Adam's ecstatic cry? This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This woman, this bride, this wife that God has given me is part of my own flesh. She is part of my own body. He who loves his wife loves whom? Loves himself. Do you see the closeness, the intimacy, the indivisible unity that is to exist in our relationship with our wives? You see, when we love our wives, men, we are loving nothing less than a part of and the essence of our own selves. That's how close and intimate this union is. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, and then he flips back to the standard, which is God's relationship with His people. You love and cherish your own flesh just as Christ loves and cherishes the church. Now, there's a whole point in that we're going to try to unfold in the idea of us being one flesh with Christ, that is absolutely beautiful in the New Testament, because we are members of His body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and he goes back and Paul quotes Genesis chapter 2 verse 23. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then he says this mystery is profound. and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself. This is a profound mystery. This institution of marriage that joins together and unifies one man and one woman is of such profound depths of mystery that the only way in which that relationship can be rightly understood is in terms of God's love for his people. I am referring, Paul says, to the relationship that exists between Christ and the church. So we see that the profound mystery of marriage is brought to full light in the New Testament by the relationship of Christ, the bridegroom, with the church. The church is his elect and precious bride. So we see this. We see this unfolded very beautifully in the New Testament, and this is going to be developed further in future lessons. In addition to this profound unity, this indivisible intimacy that exists between husband and wife, there is a purposeful exclusivity in this relationship. There is a purposeful exclusivity in this relationship. Adam has exclaimed, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, therefore she shall be called woman because she is taken out of man." The narrator, Moses, resumes in verse 24, and he says, I'm sorry, did I not give you your bullet point? Did everybody get that? The profound mystery of marriage is brought to full light by the New Testament relationship of Christ the bridegroom with the church, his elect and precious bride. You should have been able to fill that one in without seeing it. But Moses resumes the narration after Adam's exclamation here, and Moses adds this, therefore. Why? Therefore, it's referring back to verse 23. Because of this profound unity, this bone-flesh kinsman relationship, Moses says, because of that, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast or cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. A man shall leave his father and his mother. You know what is really profoundly interesting here? If you understand the Hebrew culture, a young man almost never physically left his family when he married a bride. In fact, most of the time, he would build an addition onto his father's house, and he would go and marry his bride and bring his bride into his father's house. So we know that when Moses says that a man should leave his father and mother, he's not talking about physically separating himself from his father and mother. But he says that a man should leave his father and mother. I believe that this is a prescription by Moses, inspired by God, for the exclusive loyalty and intimacy that a man must give his wife. The marriage union, guys, is so deeply profound and intimate that its bonds exceed the depths of the bonds of the parent-child relationship. Let me repeat that. The intimacy of the bonds of marriage are so profound that they exceed the intimacy of the bonds between parent and child. You see, when we're joined to our wives, men, and wives, when you're joined to your husbands, your first obligation and loyalties lie with your spouse at that point. Now, you might ask why make such a point of that. Well, look around yourself in our culture. We're all familiar with the